we're looking at the economic impact of British rule in India. Over the course of nearly 2 centuries, the Indian economy underwent this massive shift. It went from being a self-sufficient global powerhouse to essentially a colonial economy that was designed from the ground up to serve British interests. So we're going to rely on detailed historical sources to break down exactly how this happened, step by step.
Okay, let's dive into this by looking at a contrast that is just frankly staggering. According to economic historians, at the beginning of the 18th century, India commanded roughly 23% of the entire global economy. I mean, it was a massive exporter of textiles and agricultural goods. Fast forward to when India gained independence in 1947, and that share had literally plummeted to a mere 3%. And our sources emphasize that this wasn't just some natural economic decline. It was the direct result of systemic, structural changes forced upon the economy. So to understand how this massive shift actually happened, from the everyday micro level all the way up to the macro level, we're going to walk through 5 key areas. First, we'll look at the ruin of artisans. Second, the impoverishment of the peasantry. Third, the destruction of Indian industry. Fourth, we'll cover the economic drain theory. And finally, we'll synthesize it all by looking at the 3 distinct stages of colonialism.
Right, let's jump straight into part 1, the ruin of artisans, and how highly skilled weavers were forced to become farmers.
The sources describe this as the very beginning of a brutal deindustrialization process. For centuries, Indian artisans, especially weavers, relied heavily on the patronage of native rulers and nobles. But as the British East India Company moved in and annexed these Indian states, well, that royal patronage completely vanished overnight. Suddenly, you had these incredibly skilled craftsmen with absolutely no local buyers for their premium goods. And the tragedy here is that, unlike in Europe, where artisans who lost their traditional crafts were absorbed into new machine-based factories, in India, no steps were taken towards modern industrialization. These artisans were just left totally destitute. To truly grasp the human cost of this, just listen to this chilling quote from William Bentinck, who was a British Governor-General of India at the time. He actually wrote, "The misery hardly finds a parallel in the history of commerce. The bones of cotton weavers are bleaching the plains of North India." It's a grim, powerful testament to the absolute devastation faced by these workers, who were literally starving as their entire livelihoods were dismantled around them.
And this triggered a chain reaction that historians refer to as ruralization. It worked like this. First, as we just saw, artisans lost their local royal patronage. Second, to stop them from selling abroad, the British slapped massive tariffs, we're talking nearly 80%, on Indian textiles entering Europe. That completely killed Indian exports. At the exact same time, they flooded the Indian market with cheap, machine-made British cloth, imported completely duty-free. It was a classic, brutal, one-way free trade policy. Finally, with literally no way to sell their goods, these artisans had to abandon their ancestral professions. They migrated out of the towns and back to the villages just to take up farming, which piled immense pressure onto an agricultural sector that was already struggling.
Which brings us perfectly to our second section. Let's see how this sudden influx of people fueled a massive agrarian crisis and the total impoverishment of the peasantry.
Imagine being a farmer and getting hit from 3 sides at once. The source material calls this the triple burden. First, you had the colonial government, whose only real interest was squeezing out maximum land rents to secure their revenue. Second, you had the zamindars. Now, many of the old traditional zamindars were actually ruined by the new colonial systems, and they were replaced by this new class of ruthless absentee landlords. These new landlords resorted to summary evictions and demanded all sorts of illegal dues, completely stripping the peasant tenants of their traditional land rights. And third, to pay for all of this, the desperately overburdened peasant had nowhere to turn but the local moneylender, who charged exorbitant interest rates and manipulated the legal system to keep them trapped in debt. Now, we usually think of the commercialization of agriculture as a sign of progress, right? But the sources stress that for the Indian peasant, it was a forced, deeply destructive process. Farmers were basically compelled to stop growing life-sustaining food grains and start cultivating cash crops for the British, like indigo, cotton, and tea. This suddenly linked poor subsistence farmers directly to the wild volatility of international markets, and it led directly to the stagnation and deterioration of everyday agriculture. For example, when global prices for cotton crashed in 1866, it wasn't the British buyers who suffered, it was the Indian cultivators who faced heavy indebtedness and total ruin.
And the direct result of this systemic crisis, this total lack of food security, was absolutely catastrophic. Between 1850 and 1900, an estimated 2.8 crore. To put that into perspective, that is 28 million people died in famines across India. Just let that astronomical number sink in for a second. The historical sources are incredibly clear on this. These famines were not just simple natural crop failures. They were a direct result of the extreme poverty and the systemic vulnerability created by colonial economic policies that were actively making India poor.
Okay, let's shift our focus from agriculture to the broader economy, with our third section, the destruction of Indian industry and its deliberate decline.
The source material features this very pointed quote from author Shashi Tharoor, noting that the nationalist critique of the colonial economy argues that this wasn't just a natural shift. He writes that deindustrialization was a deliberate British policy, not an accident. It was a systematic destruction abetted by tariffs and regulatory measures that stacked the deck entirely in favor of British industry. So they weren't just out competing Indian goods, they were using the law to consciously dispossess Indian manufacturers. And when you look at the actual laws passed by the British Parliament, that intent to suppress thriving indigenous sectors becomes undeniably clear. Take textiles. Amazingly, the British actually stopped paying for Indian textiles with their own British pounds. Instead, they just used the tax revenue they had just extracted from Bengal to buy the goods. It's wild to think about. Or look at shipbuilding. India had a massive, world-class shipbuilding industry, but specific laws passed in 1813 and 1814 literally prohibited Indian-built ships from plying major trade routes to America and Europe. Later on, when the Indian steel industry started to emerge, it was legally restricted to producing only high-standard steel specifically for British quotas. This deliberately boxed them out of broader consumer markets, ensuring a very late and stunted development of modern industry in India. Naturally, all of this on-the-ground reality sparked massive national unrest. In fact, this economic issue became a primary stimulant for the early nationalist movement. That brings us to Section 4, the economic drain theory. First articulated by early nationalist thinkers like Dadabhai Naoroji, the economic drain is defined as a portion of India's national wealth and product that was siphoned away to Britain purely for political reasons without India getting any adequate economic or material returns. Naoroji pointed out a crucial difference here. Previous conquerors had settled in India and spent their wealth locally, but this new colonial system was different. It drained the wealth away, completely unseen, peaceably and subtly. So where exactly was all this money going? Well, a huge chunk of it went to paying the very high salaries and vast pensions of British civil and military officials. It went toward paying interest on loans that the colonial government took out, which were often used to fund British wars of expansion. It also included profits made on foreign investments in India and compulsory payments made for British shipping and banking services. This constant one-way, outward flow starved India of the capital it desperately needed for its own industrial growth. And ironically, that very same extracted wealth was acting as the fuel accelerating the British Industrial Revolution back in Europe. Okay, let's zoom out and pull all this together. We're going to organize everything we've learned into a historical framework in our fifth and final section, the 3 stages of colonialism. Historians generally divide British colonial rule in India into 3 distinct stages, stretching from the Battle of Plassey in 1757 all the way into the 20th century. These are the period of merchant capital, the era of free trade colonialism, and finally, the era of foreign investments. Let's do a quick run-through of how the strategy evolved. Stage 1 lasted from roughly 1757 to 1813. This was the era of merchant capital. Basically, during this time, the East India Company just acted as a giant monopoly. Their primary goal was to dominate trade and to directly appropriate state revenues from places they conquered like Bengal. At this early stage, they weren't really trying to fundamentally change traditional Indian society or culture. They just wanted to efficiently collect revenue to finance their exports. Then comes stage 2, running from 1813 to the 1860s. This is the era of free trade. As the Industrial Revolution really took hold in Britain, British capitalists demanded that India become a captive market for their newly manufactured goods. So the colonial economy was actively re-engineered. India was integrated into world capitalism purely as a supplier of raw materials, like that raw cotton we talked about, and as a massive dumping ground for finished British goods. This is the exact one-way free trade policy that completely destroyed the Indian artisans. Finally, we hit stage 3, beginning in the 1860s, the era of foreign investment. This is when British capital was poured into India to build infrastructure, most famously the railways. But the sources are quick to point out that this growth of trade and railways was designed to help Britain, not India. The railways were built primarily to suck raw materials out of the interior to the ports and to quickly move British troops around to maintain control. Interestingly, the ideological justification shifted during this time too. This intense control was now framed as a permanent trusteeship over the Indian people, a deeply patronizing concept that was famously dubbed the white man's burden.
Which brings us to our final thought for today. The nationalist thinkers of the time powerfully argued that infrastructure projects like the railways were not generous gifts of modernization. Rather, they were highly sophisticated tools designed to accelerate the economic drain and move wealth out of the country faster. So, I want to leave you with this question to reflect on. If colonial infrastructure primarily facilitated wealth extraction and deindustrialization, how should we evaluate the true cost of modernization in a colonized economy? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope this helps structure your understanding of a deeply complex and pivotal era in history. I'll see you next time.